Well, thanks so much for being with us today. I hope you've had an opportunity to download the message outline. Go ahead and take that out. And I want to begin today with a question I'm sure that you have pondered about through the year. Here's the question. Why are people who've had too much to drink inclined to make bad decisions? Why is that true? Now, if you've been at New Hope a long time, you've heard me say this before. Alcohol has never been an attraction for me at all. It has nothing to do with my decision to follow Jesus. Probably has more to do with the decision that happened when I was about 7 or 8 years old. My father had played golf on a hot summer afternoon, and he had come home. He was drinking an ice-cold beer. And so I said to my dad, "Can I have a drink?" And my father, being a wise father, he said, "Sure." And he gave me that can of beer. Now, those of you who know me know I have a very sweet tooth, and I've always heard that alcohol is an acquired taste. I can still remember the taste of that beer. That was the awfulest thing I'd ever had in my entire life. And so from then on, it's like, I have no desire to have alcohol. Just give me my Coca-Cola and I'm good. But my junior year of college at the University of Alabama, I was in a social fraternity, and Tennessee and Alabama were playing their annual football game. They played on the third Saturday of October. And we had gotten tickets, some of our fraternity brothers had gotten tickets, so we traveled to Knoxville, Tennessee to see the game. When we drove to the stadium, Nyland Stadium on the campus of the University of Tennessee on that Saturday, we were able to park, and we went to the Lambda Chi Alpha house. We were part of that fraternity at Alabama, there, Tennessee, sorority brothers, all that kind of, fraternity brothers, not sorority, fraternity brothers. And so anyway, we went there before the game, and they were real nice, and we were going to come back after the game and meet up there. So we went to the game. It was about 5 blocks away, about a half a mile away. Saw Alabama eke out a 20-13 game. It was very, very exciting. And so after the game was over, we weren't in any hurry to try to get in the crowd to walk out, so we waited around a while. And all of a sudden, I looked around, and none of my fraternity brothers were there, except one. They had all gone. I went, where did they go? But the only one that was left was a guy named Gerald Phillips. Gerald was a senior at the University of Alabama, and Gerald was not drunk. He was plastered. He was beyond drunk. He was so drunk, he could not even walk down the stairs. And so it was almost like there was Gerald. He was about 230 pounds. I was 130 pounds. And if you've seen somebody who's injured or hurt, you're trying to put your arm around them and trying to walk them down and stuff. There I was trying to escort Gerald back to the Lambda Chi Alpha house. But not only was Gerald drunk, he was also belligerent. And as we walked along, and there were thousands and thousands of Tennessee fans streaming outside the stadium and stuff, he would say things to them. And he could even speak. He had a slurred voice. And, Tennessee sucks. And he was just saying stupid stuff. And I said, "Gerald, shut up. You're going to get us beat up. Shut up, Gerald." And he just continued on. And I was constantly saying to the people that we would encounter, "I am so sorry. He is plastered beyond belief. I am so sorry." And we eventually, by God's grace, we made it back to the fraternity house. But the question remains, why are people like Gerald? Why are people who've had too much to drink, why are they inclined to make bad decisions? Well, medically, there's actually a couple of reasons for this. Here's the first one. Alcohol increases, now look at this word. Man, that is $1 million word. Norepinephrine. That's the best I can come up with. But here's what it does. It acts as a stimulant and increases impulsiveness, and it decreases inhibition. Well, you see that in someone who's had too much alcohol. Here's the second reason. Alcohol temporarily impairs the activity of the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that enables you and me to think rationally and make good decisions. So it impairs that part of our brain. In other words, here's what alcohol does. It frees a person to act without thinking clearly or feeling appropriately. It's kind of like the comedian Ron White, who after he was arrested for public intoxication, he said this. He said, "I had the right to remain silent, but I did not have the ability to." That's a pretty good description of what alcohol does in our life. People who drink too much are inclined to make bad decisions because temporarily they're desensitized to social and cultural and especially relational cues in life. What is obvious to everyone else is oblivious to them. It's almost like their conscience is switched off. And it was not unusual for somebody the next day to say something like, I did what? Are you sure it was me? It's like, yeah, it was on video. Oh, that type of a deal on that. But what does this have to do with you? You may be wondering. Well, if you're drunk, it'd be obvious. But most of you, hopefully, you're sober. And so just hang in there in a few moments. I'm going to explain how this relates to you and to me. We're on a message series entitled Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. And if you missed any of the messages in the series, go to our website at newhopeeastlake.org. Click on messages, and all of our messages are archived. You can even download a message outline. But the big idea in this series is we often overlook the relationship between good questions and good decisions. And the truth is, good questions set us up to make good decisions. In this series, I've made you a promise that if you will ask these 5 questions that we're looking at each week, one by one, if you'll ask them, if you'll honestly answer them, and then you'll act on your answers, here's the promise. You will make better decisions and you will have fewer regrets in life. And even more importantly, not only will you be better off, but those who love you, those you care about the most, will be better off as well, because you are not the only one impacted by your decisions, and certainly not by your regrets as well. In this series, we've been learning a Bible passage. It's just one sentence. It's a wisdom saying. Proverbs 27:12, it tells us this: the prudent means wise. The wise person sees danger, and it says they take refuge. They take an appropriate action. I've given you the picture of a road blockage where it says bridge out ahead, detour. A wise person sees that, and what do? They take the detour. On the other hand, the simple, this is the naive person, the person who doesn't ask a lot of questions, believes most anything. They don't connect the dots to understand that today's decisions impact tomorrow's outcomes. The simple person, what do? They keep going. They come to that road sign and they say, you know what? That sign applies to everybody else but me. Somehow I'm different. I'm special. I don't need to go the detour. I'm going this way. And they pay the price. They suffer the consequences for their decision. If you ask, and we said this last week, if you do ask these 5 questions, begin to deal with them, it's going to bring you in conflict with the sales associate that lives inside your mind. We all have this sales associate that lives inside, and they're constantly telling us, act now, decide fast, focus on the immediate, not the ultimate. If you will learn these questions and ask them, it will slow you down to see potential danger ahead. So we've looked at 2 questions up to date. The first question we call the integrity question. 2 weeks ago we asked this one, and it's simply, am I being honest with myself? Now, it's so easy to be dishonest with ourselves and to fool ourselves that we need to ask this question a second time and add another word. Am I being honest with myself really? Am I really being honest with myself? And the decision we needed to make as a result of this integrity question is this: that I will not lie to myself even when the truth makes me feel bad about myself. And I'll be honest with you. If you are honest with yourself, there's going to be times you do feel bad about yourself. But we have to make this integrity decision. Then last week we looked at the second question. It's the legacy question, and it's simply, what story do I want to tell? Because all the events and chapters in our life, after a while we look back on them, they simply are a part of our story. And so when you tell the story, when somebody else may tell the story for you, what kind of story do you want them to tell? Do you want to be a hero, or do you want to be a bad guy? You want to be a good example or a bad example? Is this a story that you want to be able to tell your kids and your grandkids, or is it a story that you hope and you pray nobody else ever finds out about? The good news, as we said last week, is we write our own stories, and we do it one decision at a time. So decision 2 that we looked at last week, the legacy decision, is this: I will decide a story that I'm proud to tell, and I will not decide anything that makes me a liar for life. And if you were with us last week, we looked at the story of Joseph and how his 10 brothers beat Joseph up, sold him as a slave, and then they had to tell a lie to their father. They said that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. This broke their father's heart. This was a lie now that they were forced to live with for the rest of their lives. They could not even tell other people. And what we're saying is this: you and I need to make a decision not to lie about anything that will make me a liar for life. Now, back to our intoxicated folks. They cannot pay attention to external or internal cues, as we've already talked about. But us sober folks, on the other hand, we're often guilty of choosing to ignore those same external or internal clues or cues in our life. Isn't that true? Look at this next fill in the blank. Intoxicated people have basically silenced their conscience. But sober people, here's what we do. We often choose to ignore our conscience. And when we say the word conscience, we're referring to this internal tension that's competing for our attention, if you would. When you and I are considering a decision, we're considering perhaps an option to make. Our conscience is helping us say, if you choose that option, it could lead you to a regret in life. Intoxicated people can't help themselves, but sober people often, here's our problem, we won't help ourselves. And the outcome, the consequences are no less devastating whichever route you take. So the conscience question is our third question, what we want to look at today. The conscience question is simply this: is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? In other words, when you're making a decision and there's an option that you consider, all of a sudden that option creates within you a kind of a tension, an uneasiness. It causes you to kind of hesitate, to pause, if you would. This is often referred to as what many people call a red flag moment. A red flag moment. And what they're referring to is this: it's an internal sense of, I'm not sure why, but something about this just doesn't feel right. I don't know what it is. I can't put my finger directly on it. Don't ask me any questions because I probably can't answer you. But something about this decision I'm about to make, something just doesn't feel right. Been there? My guess is certainly every one of us have. When this happens, here's what we need to do. You owe it to yourself to pause and pay attention to that tension in your life. Don't ignore it. Don't try to brush it off. Don't try to talk yourself out of it. Let it bother you. Let me say that again. Let it bother you. Pay attention. You may say, well, I've got to make a decision. I'm kind of in a hurry. That salesperson in your mind is always in a hurry. Don't forget that. Often, here's what happens. In most instances, here's what we think. You know, what's bothering me doesn't seem to be bothering anybody else. So really then, probably it's just not a big deal, is it? Probably it's just nothing. It's just me. Well, maybe it is something. Maybe it's actually something that you need to pay attention to. Ray Nager, in his article, Red Flag Decision Making, he said this: emotions serve a purpose, informing us what to do. If our brain comes across something and categorizes it as a red flag, we will be notified through thoughts and feelings created by emotion. This red flag alerts us to pay attention. Our emotions act as a cueing system, notifying us to pay attention, and notice this, and to also take actions. Probably what you're dealing with is probably not illegal, probably not immoral, but there's something in you that feels there's just something not right about this. These red flag moments are actually a specific part of our brain alerting us to pay attention. So pay attention to the tension. And if we pause, we stand a far better chance of making a better decision, a good decision. But have you ever had this occur? Often when you're considering something, then all of a sudden somebody comes along and they point out something you had not considered in this process. And now suddenly there's a tension, whereas before there was no tension. Maybe it was one of your parents. Maybe it was your mom. Honey, all that sounds really good except for the fact I think it's illegal. Suddenly there's some tension there. Maybe a friend says, hey, I thought you were on a diet. Suddenly there's some tension. Another friend says, that sounds good, but what is your husband, what is your wife going to say when they find out about this? Suddenly there's some tension. Does your boss know about this? Suddenly there's some tension. Can you afford that? Suddenly there's some tension. But it's a tension that we need to pay attention to. Here's what happens. This will often create in us relational tension between people. Relational tension. Why? Because we all have a tendency to dodge the truth by discounting the truth teller. In other words, we look at the person talking to us or telling us that and we go, well, what do they know? What does he know? What does she know? What does Pastor Russ know? He hangs around with drunk people. What does that guy know, type of a thing? That person's never been in my shoes before. They've never led a company. They could even run their own life. Look at their kids. They don't know what they're talking about. My mom doesn't know real estate. She doesn't know finances. We fall prey to what's referred to as the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy. And by the way, if you go to work on Monday or something, and somebody asks you what you did during the weekend, and you say, well, I went to church. Well, what do they talk about? If you want to impress your friends, you say, oh, we talked about the genetic fallacy. And then you can roll it out on them here. Here's what it means. Since I don't like where the information's coming from, I'm just going to ignore the information. In other words, I don't necessarily like you, so guess what? I don't care what you say. I'm going to ignore it, even if it's true, even if it's right, even if I need to hear it. Because I don't like you, I'm going to ignore that information. But we need, look at this, we need to pay attention to the tension regardless of the source. Regardless of the source. Think of it this way. Haven't you given plenty of really, really good advice to a lot of people that you don't even follow yourself? Pay attention to the source, whatever it may be. Face it. Embrace it. Don't excuse it. Face that tension until either it goes away or you decide to go in a different direction. Now, there's a great story found in the Old Testament portion of our Bible that illustrates the importance of paying attention to seemingly sometimes irrational or often inconvenient tension in our life. It's a story about a man we refer to as David or King David. We know that David, when he was only probably an early teen, was crowned or anointed to be the next king of the nation of Israel. This was done secretly by the prophet Samuel. God directed him to do that, and his family was kind of bewildered by it all. But several years passed by. David's now in his late teens. He becomes a national hero when he fights Goliath the giant, and he slays Goliath. Everyone knows David's name. Saul is jealous of David, the attention that he's getting. And so he invites him, though, to come be part of his own household, to be a servant as well. Not like a maidservant, but serving the king and the kingdom, if you would. Saul continues, his jealousy continues to grow. He literally tries to kill David. David has to flee the capital city of Jerusalem. He flees away to the desert, the only safe place he could go. David was considered by many people to be an incredible leader and warrior, and so hundreds of people, several hundred, flocked to David. And so he has this small army army of men that are with him. They have no home. There's no city they can go to because the king will find them. So they're out in the desert kind of roaming, avoiding King Saul and his men. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 through 3, we find this is happening. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all over Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. So Saul and his men are going to try to find David because Saul wants to eliminate this threat to the throne. Saul wants his son Jonathan to be the next king, so he goes looking for David. David obviously gets some type of intel information, and he tells his men, Saul's army is coming. They're near. Let's scatter. Let's hide in the hills in small groups, and after he passes, we'll come back together. In verse 3, we're told this, that Saul came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Guess which cave he chose of all the caves? David and his men were far back in this very cave. Just think about this just for a moment. Saul with his men, they're traveling. 3,000 men are traveling. And all of a sudden, the king has to go to the restroom. So they stop and he dismounts. He sees this cave and he walks into this cave. And as he walks in, he's just a silhouette, the sun shining behind him. But the men, David and the men in the cave quickly realize King Saul is right before our very eyes. As he walks into that dark place, his eyes do not adjust. He cannot see David and his men hiding a little further back into the cave. So he walks a little ways in to maintain his privacy so no one from the outside could see in. He tosses his robe, takes it off and tosses his robe to the side. He then hikes up his other garment. He squats down facing the front of the cave. David's men are behind him. What do you think David and his men were thinking? They were thinking, this is an omen. This is a direct sign from God. God has delivered to you, David, your enemy. What else could it be? In verse 24, or chapter 24, verse 4, here's what happens. Now's your opportunity, David's men whispered to him. Today the Lord is telling you, David, this is from God. I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do with you as you wish. They knew, David's men knew that he had been anointed to be the next king of the nation. And they're saying, David, God has arranged this. Do it. Do it. Do it now. So David creeps forward. It was the perfect scenario. There didn't have to be a civil war in the country. There had to be minimal bloodshed. David just needed to kill Saul. He would cut off his head. He would walk out in front of those 3,000 men with Saul's head, holding Saul's head. They would immediately rally around David as their new king. David, as inch by inch, he creeps closer to Saul. His heart is pounding. The adrenaline is flowing. This was the day God had told him about. David felt pressure to act. But notice this, as he crept forward towards King Saul, as he did that, as he pulled out his dagger with every intention of slitting Saul's throat, David felt something else. There was a tension. There was a tension about what he was doing. There was a hesitation. And David knew in his heart of hearts something about this just wasn't exactly right. But here's the thing. David's hesitation, it made absolutely no sense. It didn't make sense. And David did what many of us do. He proceeded to act. He pulls out his dagger. If David is successful, for David and his men, they knew everything would instantly change. But as he gets closer, that tension increases. There seems to be no other alternative. He has to take King Saul's life. But notice what happened. David paid attention. David paid attention to that tension in his life, to that tension that was bothering him. He is just seconds away from taking Saul's life, and then he gets clarity. David realizes this isn't war. This isn't combat. This is murder. This is murder. That can't be right. David reflects, who put Saul on the throne in the first place? God did that. Who am I to replace what God has put in place? This can't be God's plan. I cannot kill the king even though the king is trying to kill me. And this is where you and I have something in common with David at this moment. David didn't know for sure the outcome of his decision to kill King Saul. He did not know what that outcome would be. Now think about it just for a moment. He thought he knew. He thought he knew if he did this, how things would play out, that the people, the soldiers would rally around him, he would be the next king, but there was no guarantee that things would work out the way he had envisioned it. His men thought they knew. It was very simple. You kill the king, you become king, problem solved. But don't miss this next fill in the blank. Look at this. One of the reasons that we ignore tension, that we ignore the advice of others, that we ignore our conscience, is because when we're making decisions, we believe that we can predict the future and that we can control outcomes. We think we know, and we make decisions that we often regret because we don't know and we cannot predict. And as a result, we have disappointment. And if you think about disappointment, here's a great definition. It's simply what we experience when we mispredict the future. It's kind of like that movie that everyone built up and you were so excited to see it and you saw it and it wasn't what you thought. It didn't meet your expectations and you were disappointed. It's like that football game. It was a game of the year. It was supposed to be a great game. It was a blowout. You were disappointed. It didn't meet your expectations. It was like that date you were going on. You were so excited about it and it just fizzled. It wasn't the poppins, the pizzazz you thought it would be, and you were disappointed. It's like taking your family to Disneyland, and you think this is going to be a lifelong memory, but maybe it is for all the wrong reasons, and you're there all day long for 12 hours, and you spend hundreds of dollars. You're sunburned. You only got to ride 3 rides, and you're like, it's just not what you thought it would be, and you're disappointed. Here's the point. Ignoring that tension in your gut sets you and it sets me up for disappointment. Paying attention helps us to avoid unnecessary disappointment as well as unnecessary regret. I think David also asked him the question we looked at last week, the legacy question. David probably said, what story do I want to tell? Because one thing David did not want to be the man who killed the king. That was not a story he wanted to tell. Can you imagine this scenario? David sitting around with some of his grandchildren. Grandpa David, tell us one more time about how you became king. You know how you snuck up behind King Saul while he was using the potty and you slit his throat. That was not the story David wanted to tell. So here's what David did. David changed course midstream. And instead of killing King Saul, with his knife, he cut off a part of that robe that King Saul had thrown to the side while he was relieving himself. He cut off a piece of that robe and he goes back to his men. Notice this in 1 Samuel 24 and verse 5. Afterwards, David, look at this word, he was conscience stricken. Boy, that's a great word for this tension that we often feel, why we need to pay attention to it. He was conscience stricken. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed one of the Lord. And with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and he went on his way. And Saul went back out to his men, back out to his mount, whether it was a mule or a horse, we're not sure, but he got back on it. He was ready to continue his hunt for David. And all of a sudden, they hear a voice yelling and shouting out at them. And all 3,000 men hear the voice and they look, and there stands David outside the cave that King Saul had just exited. There is the man that they had been hunting, the man they had been paid to kill, and he is holding a piece of cloth. And as they look at that cloth, it looks like a piece of King Saul's robe. And when Saul sees it, he quickly turns around, whips around, and he looks at his robe, and sure enough, there's a piece of his robe that is missing. And then David does this. Notice that he gets on the ground and he bows to King Saul. That's absolutely incredible to me that he would do that, but that's exactly what he did. Here's what happened. Look at this fill-in. For all who were gathered there that day, one thing was clear. David was the better man. David was the better man. He spared Saul's life when Saul would have taken his life. You know what David was? He was the hero in his own story. David gives a short speech and he says to King Saul, may the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. King Saul, I will not take matters into my own hands. I will not try to replace what God has put in place. And David wisely decided not to use Saul's bad behavior as an excuse to do bad things. He would not become like his enemy. And in verse 15, we find David saying this, may the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. Pay attention. Pay attention to those red flag internal warnings in your life. Even if it seems irrational, even if it is inconvenient. The reason for that is simple. That internal hesitation, that red flag, is often God's way of turning us in another direction. People who are yielded, fill in the blank, people who yield to God don't attempt to play God. They don't try to predict outcomes. Instead, here's what you and I need to do. Surrender, obey, and follow Jesus. We want to be able to be at bed at night and to know that things are good between us and our Heavenly Father. We will need to pay attention to that tension in our lives. Because if we don't, we may wake up one day on the wrong side of a decision that we would give anything if we could go back and undo or do it over again. It was certainly true of King Saul. Look at this fill-in. King Saul wasn't humiliated by David's military skills. Nope. He was humiliated by David's humility. And we're told not long after this, King Saul and his army were in a battle with the Philistines. And during that battle, a random Philistine archer shot an arrow into the Israelite army, and his arrow randomly found a seam in King Saul's armor and mortally wounded him. Saul did not want to be killed or die at the hands of his enemy, so he literally falls on his own sword and is killed as the Israelite army is routed. When word reaches back to Jerusalem what has happened, the people and citizens immediately proclaim David as their king. And he didn't even have to commit murder to get to the throne. Perhaps maybe David might have thought this. Maybe David thought to himself, well, if somebody had told me it was going to work out like that, it would certainly have made that whole cave episode a whole lot easier. If God had shown up and God had said to me, David, just relax. 7 chapters from now, the Philistines are going to take care of Saul for you. Wouldn't that have made things so much easier? But that's not how life works, is it? That's not why we have to pay, or rather, that is why we have to pay attention to the tension. That's why we dare not take matters into our own hands. That's why we dare not trust our ability to predict the future or control outcomes. That's why whenever you're making a decision of any consequence, you have to stop and ask yourself, is there a tension that deserves my attention? That leads us to our last fill-in. Here's our decision related to the conscience decision. I will pause even when I can't pinpoint the cause of my hesitation. Is there a tension in your life right now that deserves your attention? If so, pay attention to that tension. That's a decision that you'll never, ever regret. If you look on your outline at the bottom, here's some next steps I'm asking you to consider. Will you make this conscious decision today that you will pause even when I can't pinpoint the cause of my hesitation? And then here's 3 questions that I want to encourage you to continue to ask to keep the conversation going. Here's the first one. Do you have a name for your internal warning system? Do you have a name? Here's the second question. Have you ever been really close to pressing to a big decision, but at the last minute bailed for no other reason than something just didn't seem right? Did more information surface after you hit the pause button? And here's our next question. In what ways does our memory verse support the habit of paying attention to the tension? Again, our memory verse, Proverbs 27:12. The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going, and they pay the penalty or suffer the consequences for it. Also, too, I want to remind you, Fall Fest is coming up in just a few weeks on Saturday, October 23rd. We need your help. You can let us know. Reach out to us at our church office or right on your connection card online. Let us know, hey, I can help. We'd love to have you. We need you to help us with that. And then also, too, we're doing a shape class on Friday, October 15th. If you've ever kind of wondered, where do I fit in at New Hope? What are the gifts, abilities, and skills I bring that might be a blessing and benefit to our church family? Well, that's what the Shape class is all about. I want to encourage you to sign up for that. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for loving us enough to stop us in our tracks from time to time. Thank you for stirring our spirit, stirring our heart, giving us that internal hesitation, even when it's so inconvenient, even when it doesn't make sense to us. God, we ask that you give us the wisdom to pause, the courage to ask the question, and the courage and the wisdom to act on what we decide and what we discover. It's in your name that we pray, Lord Jesus. Amen.